Hello and welcome to the first episode of the SEAClearly podcast. I'm Dany Rastelli, and along me I have Captain Steve Bomgardner, VP of Shipping and Offshore here at Polestar Global, and Scott Bergeron, Managing Director at Oldendorff. A very warm welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dany.
I have to say, Scott, I was very fascinated when I learned about your backgrounds, what with DMV, USCG, CEO of Liberian Registry, and now Managing Director at Oldendorff. I think it's safe to say that you perhaps have gained a rather unique understanding of the shipping industry and the needs and pain points within. So I was hoping to kick us off with asking you your views on digitalization within the industry, and particularly what you've seen work, and probably more importantly, what you haven't seen quite work.
Yeah, where to start? I think we're a really global industry responsible for a lot of the global trade, but I think we're, in some respects, not well understood, not very prominent in global economics or the mind's eye of most people, most consumers that benefit from transport by shipping. And when it comes to innovation, digitization, all things of technology, I think there's this perception that we're very slow to try new things, that maybe we're too traditional and too conservative. And I think that's really a reflection of the lack of understanding. The sea is a dangerous place. It's not always a friendly environment. And these ships that literally traverse the world, they're operating in difficult environments. And connectivity is a major issue where I think only recently we're starting to see true breakthrough. So if you want to go back decades or even hundreds of years, you can think about the isolation that most ships had. And then slowly but surely there's been improvements from telex to email. And only really recently are we starting to see anything that's similar to a broadband connectivity. And when you couple that with the type of fuel that ships are burning, which is a residual bottom of the barrel, almost a tar type fuel that has to be heated and put under pressure, and you compare that with maybe an airplane that has pretty good communication, constant connectivity, and very clean burning, highly efficient fuel through turbines, the contrasts start to really reveal themselves and the difficulties there is to advance a lot of technology in shipping.
And of course, Steve, you've had an illustrious journey yourself. What do you think, off the back of what Scott says, has been the biggest kind of driving force of digitization in the industry right now?
Well, I think when you look at every different vertical in the industry is also different journey. I predominantly was in the offshore sector, and they were ahead in their digital journey. And I think that came down to a safety aspect and an operational aspect. So when you look at the different verticals, you can say offshore, you can say maybe your passenger and cruise, then you have your bulker, your container, your tanker markets as well. I think each one has come along at its own pace depending on the operations. When I first started on the drilling rigs, we had internet. It was slow, but we had it. So even in the early 2000s, you had connected to your home, to your spouse, to your loved ones, to email. It was regulated heavily. You had blue code filters, and you had certain things that were definitely not allowed to see. You didn't have any streaming, but at least you had something like that. Friends of mine who sailed blue water, open ocean, they didn't have any of that still. You were still using calling cards to call home at an outrageous rate. Then you have the cruise industry. Again, I think they're a little bit more mature in their digital journey because they have to be. That was just something that there was no, they have to provide for their passengers, which is their operation. Some of the markets, like the inland markets, the ferry markets, that's another market where they're very far behind in their digital journey because they don't believe they need to be because of probably cell phone usage and connectivity from local devices generalized around their operations. But I would say in general that safety was one of the big first pushes on digitization by reducing, paperwork and man hours, because, when you're doing a 10, 12-hour day and then you still had 3-4 hours of paperwork, you're going over your hours, your STCW hours. They wanted to reduce that and have you focus on the actual job and the operations. So that was, I think, the biggest push. And then understanding the data needed for informed decisions back ashore, in the oil and gas, some of those high temperature, high pressure wells, the amount of data that needed to go back to shore and on board was immense. So that was a push, obviously, to have connectivity. But you were talking also from a price standpoint. I remember I signed one, I think it was $37,000 a month was our VSAT bill for communications on a drill ship. So it was quite expensive, but obviously it was needed. And, I don't think Scott would like to see that bill on his vessels. So I think safety had a big part in the push. And now we're scratching the surface at other things. And that's, optimization of your engines, optimization of all of the different types of sensors on board, routing optimization, as well as understanding your emissions. That's, a big push for worldwide.
So you mentioned emissions, and obviously that's quite a topical conversation to have at the moment. In terms of, and perhaps this is one for you, Scott, in terms of the types of tools to be used, digital tools to be used to be more compliant, improve efficiency, where do you think we are as an industry as it stands, and what do you think could be implemented going forward to make sure that we're not only compliant, but we're compliant in a more agile way than we are perhaps right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I'm trying to think of a potentially interesting answer, but I keep coming back to, one of my preoccupations is the fuel, right? So the emissions are based on the fuel, and we're now wanting to analyze and understand fuel consumption, combustion, and therefore the emissions at a level of granular detail that the industry has really never seen before. It's really unprecedented. And it's just not so easy. I mean, you think about trying to measure sludge, right, going through a pipe under pressure at various temperatures. And while there are mass flow meters that are calibrated and designed to try to measure this, the fuel goes through a piping system with different consumers and, different combustion rates. There's different amounts of energy and different types of fuel, even if it's the same type of fuel but loaded in different ports in the world. So you're dealing with an extraordinarily high number of variables, many of which are imprecise and not so specific, all with the objective to understand how much CO2 or sulfur or particulate matter, things that are difficult to measure in their own right, are coming out of the funnel or the smokestack of the ship. So one of the biggest challenges is the quality of data, right? If we go back 10, 15 years ago and you're listening to different innovation speakers about where the industry is headed, I remember distinctly all this talk about big data. And where I think we are now is there's a lot of data, there's a lot of data available, and then there's a lot of interesting things you can do with that data. But what's the quality of the data? And that's one of the focuses that I have going on right now with our fleet, is really trying to have the best quality of data, because we're making a lot of decisions about the efficiency of the ship and what we can do to improve, and whether it's the route the ship takes to avoid weather or to avoid currents or waves, whether it's the optimal speed against the combustion, whether it's the temperatures of the cylinders, the pressures. There's so many things that we can measure. But what we're seeing now more and more is that the sensors and the different meters that we're using, they're not really robust quality. They're having difficulty giving reliably accurate measurements. So we're chasing sensors a lot rather than analyzing data. And that's really, for me, again, the focus at the moment is let's make sure the quality of the data is good. We think we know how to use it. We can run algorithms. We can develop all sorts of different contrasting metrics with this information, with this data, to try to create as much optimization as we can from any parameter. But garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I agree with you on that, Scott, too, because like, again, working offshore, every sensor was almost double, triple redundant. But there would be times where even the secondary or triple sensor had erroneous data. So what do you do? What do you trust? Do you trust your instincts, regardless of the system? So, we can, everyone here wants, in a perfect world, you pull all your high frequency data from all your sensors on board and it comes in, and that data you can trust. But in reality, there's different times when I don't believe you can trust that data based on that actual sensor in that system. And even if you have redundancies in there, depending on the tolerances and everything, there still are times where that data is incorrect. So, what do you do? Like, there's still, we still do manual soundings because we don't trust draft sensors or tank sensors. You go in, you do a manual sounding, they get the accurate, difference in fuel or potable water or whatever, because the sensor or the two sensors in there aren't giving you the correct data. So if you're thinking about fuel burn and you're taking from your main tanks to your settling tanks and then to everywhere to your engine, I think that is, just another point to where human interaction is still needed, because going back to Scott, the sensors, they're not necessarily where they need to be probably in today's world.
So
Maybe I'm wrong.
So in terms of, and this is perhaps one for you, Scott, in terms of the Fuel EU Maritime Initiative, how are you, based on what you've just said and based on perhaps the lag between the digital aspect within the industry and where we should be in order to comply with regulations, how are you preparing for this? How would you, qualify being able to prepare for something like this?
So maybe a little bit of background about Oldendorff Carriers. We're a large dry bulk ship owning and operating organization. We have about 120 ships that we own, and we charter in on any given day another 500 to 600. So we're operating anywhere between 600 and 700, 750 ships on a given day. And we have a huge group of people who are out there organizing cargo for us to carry around the world. And everything is dry bulk, so unpackaged commodities, raw materials. So everything that I'm about to say are from that perspective. And when we look at the environmental regulations that are now focused on emissions, including what you just mentioned, the Fuel EU Maritime regulations, as well as there's this MRV and the ETS. These are all European-driven initiatives to tax and try to motivate reduced carbon emissions. The first thing is that the industry needs a common global standard, because what's very unhelpful is that we have different standards, different regulations that often contradict each other around the world. And then even looking at the European structure, they have this emission trading scheme, ETS, and now Fuel EU Maritime. And these are run by different directorates within the EU, and they're contradicting each other. So it gets very confusing. They use some of the same terminology, but they have different definitions. But as a large player moving a lot of cargo in and out of Europe, sometimes on our own ships, sometimes on ships that we've chartered in, we took the position that we're probably in the best view to take responsibility of this. So while some ship owners say, well, someone else has chartered my ship. They're the one telling it where to trade, what speeds to govern. Someone else might be buying the fuel. That this problem doesn't sit with me. The people who control the cargo and benefit from the transportation, they might take the position that, well, it's not my ship. I'm not the one actually emitting cargo. So we're a little bit in the middle of all that, and we just took the decision that we have to be responsible. We'll organize it between the parties. The principle, of course, is that the polluter pays, and who's the polluter? The polluter is the entity benefiting from the transportation. So through that whole chain, it gets very complex very easily when we talk about Fuel EU, which is your question. It's really driven about, the regulation is driven on what type of fuel you're using, what type of fuel you're putting into the ship. And then there are requirements, whether you're importing into Europe, exporting out of Europe, or trading between European states. And then there's a calibration of what percentage of carbon that should be reduced in the fuel over a period of time. So having a team, when we're in a luxurious position that we have a whole team that's dedicated on that and can look through the entire value chain from sourcing the fuel, which now this regulation is requiring fuel producers and the people who deliver fuel around the world to basically offer up a new category, different types of fuel meeting these requirements. So there's a lot of infrastructure there, all the way through to paying the fees for compliance, and then making sure the entity is responsible and the benefactors of the transportation. And then you get on the physical side of the ship, and we only have limited space to carry a couple of types of fuel. So now suddenly we have to carry more and different types of fuel, but you only use one type of fuel if you're coming into Europe or leaving Europe. But when you're in the rest of the world, you might be using a different type of fuel, and it starts to get really complex very, very quickly. So what are we doing? I mean, we literally have a task force on this, and we have yet another meeting tomorrow afternoon where we're bringing all of the different parties to the table internal to our company, just so everybody can understand through that entire process, or value chain, as I call it, where everyone can kind of raise their hand and say, don't assume that this is going to happen because these are my constraints, and then get that holistic understanding. And that's really how we're approaching it. It's, getting into late October. The requirements start in 1st of January, but it is a phased approach. And I think the simple way to understand this is, I liken it to automotive fuel, where you start to see ethanol content, right? Where you have E5, E10, different levels of that. And really that's where I think the shipping industry is headed right now, is using some type of biofuel that has a 5, 10, 20, 24 is a common percentage, and even what they call B30, 30% bio content to reduce the carbon. But that's just the beginning. I mean, the intent is to switch to different types of fuels, different types of propulsion, and then there's these complex formulas that you use to try to make sure that you're complying with the carbon reduction requirements of this regulation.
How readily have you seen some of those biofuels, Scott, and have you seen, because I am curious on what do you use to, I guess, identify which biofuels in which port, or are they pretty easily, readily available in most major ports or where you're operating out of?
Well, it's become more commonplace, but I don't think that there's been a lot of flow, right? Some of the container liners have been using biofuels for years. We've done some voyages with biofuel, but it was really more experimental. We have, parties that were willing to pay a premium for this. We were willing to make sure that it worked well with our engines and our structure. So at the moment, there is availability, but it can be difficult if you're a large buyer like we are to get commitments on volume. And another additional complexity to all this is, what is the bio content of the fuel? I mean, you can't just say, well, we want biofuel. There can be anything from cashew shells to used cooking oil to pyrolysis-based biomaterial. there's a whole menu of 100 different types of biofuel, and some are very unsafe for shipping, that they can destroy the engines and create a huge risk, for an engine to be out there completely incapacitated by the fuel. So there's this science behind all this, and to understand, okay, I want biofuel, I want a certain percentage of biofuel to make sure I comply with the regulations, but I need to know what the bio content is. Is it fit for the shipping bunker industry? And I think the entire supply chain is coming to grips with that. 18 months ago, we had a very, very difficult time getting a certificate of sustainability, which generally talks about a lot of, what the source of the bio is, what the logistic chain was, and what the actual carbon content on a holistic view is from some of the biggest oil majors in the world. So like only 18 months ago, we couldn't get these certificates in a robust and confident way. So we're coming along. I think this January 1st deadline will be a bit of a watershed moment. I think the industry is going to be ready and will be able to comply. And then you're going to start to see the demand. And in some respects, I think shipping is ahead of others, and we're not competing too much for bio content, but you can see, in short order, as these regulations continue to take effect, that there'll be a lot of parties fighting for the same quality bio content for their energy.
See, I had a slight follow-up question. It may be a slightly contentious question, but you and your team are prepared for what's to come, and it sounds as if you are prepared for the eventuality of what's to come. What do you believe could be the implications of not being prepared for this, in terms of actually being exposed to what's to come with the Fuel EU initiative? What do you think the implications could be of not being prepared, not really putting as much resource into being prepared for it?
Well, maybe I'll take out some of the pressure from a balloon. I've been in shipping for almost 35 years, and I can't think of a single regulation that was not complied with in a timely fashion by the shipping industry. So coming back to my original premise in the opening, that perhaps we're misunderstood, perhaps we're accused of being conservative and slow to adopt, but whether you go back just the last 2-3 decades, the ISM code, the ISPS code, one regulation that was very difficult to comply with was related to ballast water. Well, that's because the regulations overshot the technology. And then what they ended up having to do was adjust the regulation and the timeline to meet the advancements, or the slow advancement in the technology to basically clean the ballast water as was expected. So I think, generally speaking, when you talk about proper shipping entities, there's always outliers, there's always people trying to cut corners, but that's really a minority. And you're going to see that the industry will comply. But if the regulation outpaces what is physically possible, then there's going to be some type of adjustment. And, when we talk about decarbonizing a very difficult to reduce carbon, right? Shipping is a very high energy intensive industry, and it's not one that can easily be replaced. You can't just put some batteries in a ship. So this hard to abate sector, saying that we're going to completely decarbonize it, that's way overshooting where technology is today. So coming back to your question, keeping in mind that I think it's, generally speaking, a pretty good compliance culture industry who meet the requirements or meet the intents of the regulation. The EU has put very clear penalties in place for not complying with Fuel EU. And there's actually some talk that that's part of the compliance strategy, is if and when it's not possible, then you build the penalties into the freight rate, so to speak. So, the shipper who is moving his cargo from here to there, one of his options will be, I will pay to play. I will pay the penalty, because that is easier than actually identifying, sourcing, using, or not being able to obtain or procure the type of fuel that's expected. So I think there'll be enforcement. I think the penalties are clear. I think the parties are willing participants to comply. And if there is just no physical, practical means to comply, there are these provisions in place. That being said, nobody can put their head in the sand, right? The ships have to be prepared. You have to assure yourself that the ships and their engines can burn the type of fuel that you can obtain. You have to understand all the different complexities that are inherent to the regulation. There's these pooling concepts, there's this reporting, there's measurement. Like, there's a lot of things that have to be done and prepared. And as I said, as an organization, we're preparing, and it's taking us months to make sure we're ready. And if you're not, then you're going to get caught in the back foot. So then you'll be facing penalties, you'll be facing commercial losses, you'll probably lose commercial opportunity, and then it can be hugely detrimental to your business.
Yeah. And in terms of, so you mentioned earlier in one of your previous answers about alternative fuels. And a question that I wanted to circle back to is, what alternative fuels are you exploring? And with that, what digital tools are helping you to track compliance with the Fuel EU regulations? Because that kind of goes back to the whole digitalization. And are we set up to support what's going on and what you need to be prepared for?
The simple answer on this is that the technology is not ready for the alternative fuels. You see a lot of headlines, you see a lot of articles, you see a lot of reports, and we can go through one by one if you like, the different types of fuel. But, maybe one of the more obvious is LNG. This is a fuel that's been around for a couple of decades. It was the fuel of the future. And then the environmentalists took a very quick and hard turn against LNG. Now you're starting to see some companies coming back to LNG. Remember, my perspective is the dry bulk industry. We don't need that much energy. Dry bulk ships are these big shoeboxes going slowly through the water. And we don't need the amount of energy that a high-speed container ship needs, that a cruise ship needs. So from our perspective, LNG is not a practical option in terms of it's trying to, hit the small nut with a sledgehammer. Plus, there's all the risks, right? Methane can be, 24 times worse than carbon, depending on the year cycle you look at. So there's methane leak concepts. It's still a fossil fuel. The availability of bio LNG is certainly a huge question mark. So it's just not the sector for us. And then we can go through, if you'd like, through the different types of fuel. But while LNG is technologically ready, ammonia is not. There's not an engine available today. And then, yes, there's even an announcement yesterday that they'll be ready to test the first engine by the end of this year. We order and buy ships all the time, and we cannot order or buy a true ammonia ship today. The methanol engines, they're not made in the size of our ship. So our size ships and the size engines we need, there's not a methanol engine ready. Talk about the availability of methanol as a fuel, talk about the environmental friendliness of methanol as a fuel. So we've gone through all of the iterations. So our emphasis is really focusing on making our ships as efficient as possible. What can we do to reduce our fuel consumption? And we're doing a lot of things in that, and we're really achieving great strides that are going to meet the requirements through the decade.
Okay. And from your perspective, Steve, with regards to, you mentioned earlier around route optimization. And one question that I wanted to come back to, particularly given what Scott just said, is what part can effective route optimization play in helping businesses to be not just compliant with this regulation or other regulations, but to really streamline their day-to-day? Because I think there's an aspect there that could be quite an interesting topic at the moment.
I mean, I think when you look at it, I think route optimization, first off, route optimization has been route optimization, forecasting, that has been around. And that is probably right now the gold standard for any type of true reduction based on external environmental conditions, based on understanding the vessel movements and stuff like that. You have all these other, things coming out. You've got Flettner rotors, you've got air lubrication, you got all these that are promising these high reductions, and some probably are delivering on that. But at the end of the day, the key part of optimizing a route based on specific, whether that's understanding your speed, your fuel consumption, understanding the area that you're operating in, utilizing currents to your advantage for if you need to hit a certain time or arrival, or being able to slow down and minimize your fuel consumption because you're doing a just-in-time arrival, or you have to meet a specific date for entrance into port. Because again, like, you're more efficient sailing than you are sitting at anchor running an engine and not burning your fuel, because when you're not running your engine at a certain percentage, your efficiencies are going down. So that fuel that's going through isn't burning properly. So what's coming out is more particulate matter, more things that haven't been combusted from that fuel. So route optimization is going to be around. I think utilizing high frequency sensors, additional data that we can put into these models to give other people different options for optimization, that's going to be the key. And that's, like the voice of Scott, the voice of the customers on what is needed to really, give them a true model and understanding of their vessel and their voyage and how that route is being optimized, whether that's through weather routing, whether that's through speed, consumption, whether that's through any other type of variable that they need to hit a certain point, or to meet their requirements from charter party or owner operator. Scott had mentioned too, again, before, about the regulations. Well, just recently we saw when, scrubbers came about, and the regulation came out for reducing your sulfurs and stuff like that. Well, no one really kind of went into, an open loop scrubber. So massive amounts of companies spent millions of dollars putting open loop scrubbers on. And then next thing you know, they're like, wait a minute, we're going to take what's in the air and then put it into the water. And then you had all these companies that now can't operate their open loop scrubber in certain coastal areas and certain, ports, because they were banned because, again, the regulation came out. Maybe it wasn't set specifically what was needed. So there was a little bit of a gray area. And then the solution that came out wasn't necessarily fit for purpose for everyone. Now, certain people perfectly fine, but it wasn't for everyone. Sorry if you hear my daughter in the background.
Yeah, that's fine. That's what makes it real. That's what
where this conversation is going.
Yeah, that's what makes these conversations real. So it's all good. It's interesting that you say that, because going back to something that actually you said, Scott, around ETS, and with the maritime sector being part of the ETS, how are you managing? How's your business managing, and how do you advocate managing both the costs but also the long-term impact and implications for fleet and operations? This is kind of my overarching question for this last segment. How would you? What's your perception of how things can be managed to effectively kind of manage this?
Yeah. So going back to my comment, where we as an organization, as a big operator, took the position that this is our responsibility to manage, and that really made things a lot simpler for us and our counterparts, our customers, the other people that we engage in, and having this holistic overview. It took a lot of the complexity for all the different entities out of it to say, okay, we can rely on Oldendorff basically managing the exposure. Because at the end of the day, when the ETS is fully implemented, we're going to be looking at about $100 million worth of exposure that we've taken on our shoulders. And this is all part of the trade. And at the most simple level, ETS, the emission trading scheme, is a pay-to-play system, right? You want to emit some carbon in order to do your business, then you have to pay the penalty to buy the allowance to be allowed to emit that much carbon. So then you really build it into the logistics costs. Now, the structure ultimately, and of course, is not just to collect money. It's really to incentivize reductions in carbon, right? So the prices aren't there right now. I mean, I look at it almost daily. I think the price of EU allowance per ton of CO2 is somewhere in the high 60s, I think, right now, euros. That's not enough to motivate radical behavior or to drive efficiency just yet. But that's correct, right? Because the technology, as I mentioned, isn't really there yet. So, how high do you increase the price of carbon against technology that just isn't available? You just can't force feed this. So at the end of the day, in dry bulk shipping, when we're carrying a cargo, generally it's one or two customers who have cargo on our ship. If you think of a container ship, they might have 20,000 containers on there, and they have some Nike shoes and some Samsung TVs and stuff from Walmart and IKEA. I mean, they could have, tens of thousands of customers on one voyage, where in dry bulk we have most often one, maybe two. So if you're splitting up the cost of this across 10,000 customers, it's a much smaller amount. If you're putting the whole cost against one customer, that's going to make a difference in their freight cost. But basically, that's what we've done. We treat it like part of the fuel. So when we fix a cargo, right, where we've contracted to carry a cargo from here to there, we know what the price of the allowance is. We know within a pretty good degree of accuracy how much fuel we expect to burn and what the emissions will come out of that. So we buy the EUAs right then and there. We build it into the freight rate that we charge the customer. And then at the end of the voyage, we have a true up, right? So we figure out how much fuel we actually burned, how much carbon we actually emitted, and then we make the final adjustment there. But then it's very transparent, very clear, and, very open. This is what it costs to secure the allowance to emit the emissions that need to be emitted to bring your cargo into Europe, out of Europe, between Europe.
Okay. And from your perspective...
Sorry. I was going to say, are you doing that in-house, Scott, or do you have, are you using a digital solution to help you with trading of the EUAs and, or do you, because you don't have a registry account, so you have to go through someone, right? Correct?
No, we do. We have a registry account, we have trading partners, we do it all in-house.
And from your perspective, Steve, coming from, I guess, another side of the industry, if I ask you the same question in terms of planning and mitigating the effects of EU ETS, what do you think the impact could be if mismanaged and everything else?
So when you look at Scott and Oldendorff, massive company, they have the money to have people to do certain things, but that's not every shipping company out there. You have a lot of companies, one vessel, 5 vessels, 2 vessels. They have a couple people, in Greece or in Germany or wherever, try to manage or operate that vessel. I think when you look at some of them that probably aren't ready or understanding the regulations or know how to navigate those regulations, I think that's where the digitization or the digital transformation needs to come into a quicker effect for them, because they may not understand or know how to get these EUAs. They may not know, who is out there is going to snake bite them with a digital tool. So for them, it's reducing their emissions, tracking their emissions. So that's another thing that I think people still maybe don't understand, how you have to track, in ballast and stuff like that. There's different rules and different regulations on that. So I think the first thing that any company needs to do is look in-house to see if they have that knowledge in-house. If not, then they need to go to companies and they need to figure out ways to streamline that data to give them what's needed, whether they're going to, whether they're going to pay it, whether they're going to push it onto their consumer, their customer, how they want to manage that. Oldendorff is probably, way more forward-thinking company than a lot out there. So they've been ready and they're ready for it. But there's a lot of companies that they know it's coming, or they're still trying to figure out the minutia. They're trying to figure out what really needs to be done. And we see that with some of the clients that we interact with, that need their emissions tracked, that now have to understand, okay, well then how do I get these, how do I do the ETS stuff? Okay, well then you need to go to a company like this, or you need to go to a trading or finance place to purchase and to set this up. So, because there's really no directive from anyone that says this is the way you need to do. They say this is what you need to accomplish, but this isn't, what exactly the process or procedure you need to follow. So other companies can do it in-house. And if you can't, you need help, I believe.
I would have to just simply agree, right? We admit that we come from a very privileged position to have the resources needed to deal with it. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of hours of people's time really digging in, understanding, going through all the different variables and evolutions to really understand it and put us in a position where we can deal with this effectively and efficiently. And yeah, thinking back to one of my old companies where we only owned and operated a dozen ships, it would have been really very, very chaotic and stressful.
Yeah, interesting. So, because we're almost at time, there is one question that I'd like to ask you both, and this is a very left field question. I'll start with you, Scott. If you could click your fingers and change one thing within the industry, make one thing happen, something be exactly how you would like it to be, what would that be? And then I'll come to you, Steve. So prepare your answer.
Yeah, this is not an easy one for me. I live in the real world, not the fantasy world. So
this is your opportunity to not live in the real world.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, to say, like, think about movies I enjoy. I really don't like the fantasy movies because it's just too far from my imagination. I don't know, but I come back to my opening premise. I think it's the fuel, right? I mean, the more I think about it, the more, I'm looking after the well-being of all of our own ships, and the complications that occur that all lead back to the type of fuel we're burning, which was done to create efficiencies, right? We're burning the fuel that nobody else in the world wants. It's the literal bottom of the barrel, right? I think beneath what we do is making asphalt for the roads. So we're burning like one step up from asphalt. And this is good in a way, right? Because we're using every drop of the barrel of oil, rather than letting some of it go to waste or into some landfill somewhere. But it creates so many difficulties, and that's risky, and that in some ways, like, we're combusting the stuff that nobody else wants, which means there are some emissions involved that are very undesirable: nitrous oxide, sulfur, carbon, I mean, you name it. So if there were one thing, then yeah, I guess it would be that dream fuel, but there is no dream fuel there. So what's next best, right? It's a cleaner, better fuel, but with that comes a lot of environmental harm that is just being put somewhere else on, if they say put the monkey on somebody else's back. And that's not what this is about. We have to take a holistic view about global emissions. We're a part of it in shipping, but all the other modes of transportation, all the other users of energy are part of that as well. And I guess my snap of the finger is a better, cleaner source of energy that's going to make so many other difficult things easy.
Good answer.
I would say I come back selfishly to the seafarers and the safety and I guess informational sharing. I still think as an industry, I still think we are siloed. We don't share certain things because we think it's going to hurt us commercially. I think from regardless of what market you're in, I think there's lessons learned for a lot of things that, again, companies keep in-house as opposed to putting it out there so other companies can learn from it and keep seafarers safe and keep the operations moving. Because again, at the end of the day, we don't have jobs if there's no seafarers. Scott doesn't have a job. I don't have a job. Dany, you're a marketing person. You probably just go to Amazon or whoever, where I don't know where you could go, maybe McDonald's or something. I don't know.
I mean,
but,
you started at Amazon and went to McDonald's, but
but I mean, like, you know, I still see it. Like, we have incidents and we have things, and it's like, wait a minute, this incident, you know, we've had other incidents like this. Why are we not learning from this? And so, you know, I guess having an area where all this information can come in, whether that's through blockchain, whether that's through something, and it's verified data, verified knowledge, verified information, everyone can learn from it. And it's not, you know, goes to your commercial, you know, it doesn't go to your bottom line, but it gives you that information, that data that could be shared. I think that's where we still need to go to. So, you know, I'm a proponent of blockchain, but how do we verify that information, that data? How do we share it with everyone, from the executives to the seafarers? I think that's clicking of the finger and getting to where we need to go.
Good. Two very educated and relevant examples. So thank you. I think that's all the time we have for this particular episode. So thank you, Steve, for all of your input. Scott, thank you so much for the insights that you've given us, and being so open about your perception of the industry and what works and what doesn't work in the industry, particularly from an emissions perspective and a digitalization perspective. So yeah, thank you very much to you both.